Thank you so much. I feel sure that Ginny Redish is one of those people of whom I could completely honestly say she needs no introduction. But so many of us have learned to let go of the words due to her wonderful book, and we are certainly looking forward to hearing from her on how to collaborate on strategies with her particular and much appreciated focus on federal websites. Ginny?
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Alex. And I'm thrilled to be here with the people in the room and with all of you who are with us remotely. We're scheduled for 90 minutes from now until 3:30. We will have a question and answer time at the end, but also Alex is monitoring the chat so that if anybody who is with us remotely has a question or a comment, please just put it in the chat and Alex will let me know that there is somebody who wants to have a conversation. I am so much more used to doing things like this with everybody in an interactive workshop, but I'm thrilled that we're able to do this remotely as well as in person so that we can reach many more people. But please do be as interactive as you want by communicating with Alex here. So our topic for today is content strategy. And of course, if we look at these two words, we're going to think both about strategy and about a particular type of strategy, the content strategy. And one of my messages, which we'll get to in a little while, is how often it is that in order to create a content strategy, you need to collaborate, and often collaborate with people who aren't used to collaborating before. But it's not just collaborating to create the content strategy, because what you really want for your content to be successful is what is now being called customer experience or customer service. That is, you want your customer, and if we're talking in a federal context, that can be stakeholders, anybody with whom your agency communicates, you want that communication and that exchange to be successful. And so we're going to talk also about strategies, content strategies, meshing with other strategies as necessary to accomplish that customer experience. But before I get to that, I want to do a little context. So what we're going to discuss in this time is, in the first place, differentiating strategy from tactics. And then I want to look back at a bit of history. I personally find this really interesting. I hope that you will too. And that will lead us to defining content strategy from different perspectives because of the different strands of history that have come together under the term content strategy. And then it's interesting, I'm doing this talk here for Plain, in part because I gave a talk for our local DC content strategy meetup in September. And some of the folks who work with folks who were in the room were there and came back and said, please, let's have Ginny do this for our audience too. And one of the questions that I got there after my hour talk was, that was all fascinating, but you didn't tell us what actually goes into a content strategy. So yes, I put that right in the middle of this afternoon's talk. And then one of the things that I think is important is to think about what content strategy you're actually involved in, because the scope of that can vary very widely. And yes, I will get to collaborating on content strategy and coordinating with other strategies. And then at the end, I'm actually going to leave strategy and talk about a very specific tactic that I think you'll find useful for carrying out your content strategy, whether or not it's evaluating the current content, planning new content. So I hope you'll stick with me all the way to this tactic at the end. Well, let's start with the idea of strategy and tactics, because I think that when I say content strategy to people, they immediately jump to start thinking about how to carry out I say, well, what is content strategy? And they will say, first you inventory the content. That is, you get a list, a spreadsheet, whatever, of all the content that you are concerned about that exists in your world, whatever that world is today. And then they'll say, and then the next thing you do is audit the content. But those aren't strategy. Those are tactics, as are hiring and training the writers and editors, setting and following an editorial calendar, if that's relevant to the world in which you're doing content strategy. And of course, the writing, editing, design, publishing, actually getting the content. Those are all tactics. And the problem is that except for inventorying the content, which you can do in a sense without a strategy, because, well, I'm not even sure you can do that without a strategy, because what content are you going to inventory? You need to know what the scope of what you're worried about is. But when you, particularly when you get to the other ones, when you get to auditing, on what basis are you auditing? So before you use the tactics, you must know what you're trying to achieve. And that's what the strategy is. The strategy is basically a blueprint for using the tactics. And so I think you need to think about content strategy at a strategy level. So what is strategy? Well, I like to think about it in terms of these 4 verbs. And when we get a little bit later to the elements of a content strategy, we'll go through them under these 4 verbs: discover, plan, align, and govern. And I see people happily taking notes, and it's wonderful. I'm happy to have you take notes, but the slides, this whole recording will be available. Catherine, yes? Yes, so this will all be available to you. So let me go back a bit and talk about where content strategy came from, because there really are 2 interesting strands. One, and the people in the field of technical communication who deal with very large bodies of documentation. And the names you might associate with this kind of content strategy are Rahel Bailey, interestingly enough, a Canadian who's now based in the UK, Anne Rockley, a Canadian, and Nazar Bina, who is in Europe. So it's interesting to me that this is not, I guess an American name I would associate with this is Joanne Hackos, but this really came out of technical communication. The other strand, which really came out of marketing and is most involved in web, is the content strategy that you would associate with Christina Halverson, Erin Kissane, who used to work for her, and Ahava Leiptag, who is here in the DC area. And I'm just curious, even in the room, which of these is the world in which you live and would be doing content strategy? For how many people would it be the technical communication, large manuals? Okay, a couple people. For how many of you would it be web? Yeah, and what I find particularly interesting is some of the differences between these 2. So both of these strands lead to inventorying the content, auditing the content, training writers. But the technical communication, the large body of documentation, is often called component content management, because it's about defining content types and using a content management system to put those components together in different ways depending on the need. Whereas a lot of the federal agencies I work with still don't even have a content management system. and yet they can do content strategy for the web. So in the web world, it's really making sure that content in different media, especially websites and social media, meets the organization's goals while meeting the user's needs. And what I find, one of the reasons I find this interesting is because I'm a linguist by training. I came into the plain language world in the, actually in the government space, but then in the technical communication space. I'm a former board member of the Society for Technical Communication. I'm still a member of the Society for Technical Communication, but for the last 2 decades, my work, my life has been in the Christina Halverson content strategy for the web world. That's just an interesting personal note, and just a little bit of this history. So let's look at some definitions, and you'll see in the definitions the focus that people have, whether or not they're in the documentation world or the, now it's not just the web world, because I think that, for example, in a government agency, if you were doing a content strategy, and I'm going to show you one of my first examples, is a corpus of letters. That a database basically of letters that this agency decided that they needed to redo. That still doesn't, it's great to have a content management system out of which that database comes, but it was in this case a matter of simply revising many letters, okay? But if we look at these definitions, we can see, for example, this first one from Anne Rockley: a unified content strategy is a repeatable method of identifying all content requirements up front, creating consistently structured content for reuse. So the component content management people are most interested in structure and reuse, which I don't think is really where the web people are. If we look at Rahel's definition, we're getting a little bit closer to bringing the 2 strands of content strategy together. Content strategists create plans to ensure that the right content gets the right audience in the right context. And that certainly is something that those of us in plain would be involved in. But if we get to Christina's, we're getting even closer to where I think most of us are. Content strategy is the practice of planning for the creation, delivery, and governance of, so there you have 2 of my 4 verbs, plan and govern. And then again, this talk today is an expansion and a redo of a talk for the Content Strategy DC meetup group, and the person who restarted that this year, Margaret Peggy Black, started us out last March with a talk on content strategy. And her definition was managing and optimizing content to meet business goals by being findable, usable, and actionable. And boy, doesn't that sound familiar for plain, right? So here we are for plain, find, understand, and use, which all of us here, and I hope that all of the hundreds of people who are with us on Zoom, many of whom may not be part of the US federal government, are familiar with the website plainlanguage.gov and with the official US guidelines there, and with the notion that the definition is, this isn't exactly the wording that Plain uses, this is my wording, but it is the same definition. Your content is usable, useful in plain language, only if the people who come or should come for it can find what they need, understand what they find, and use what they find to meet their needs. And I always add, in the time and effort that they think it is worth. Again, you can look at this at plainlanguage.gov. And in fact, today, and Catherine was at the international meeting in Oslo, where I'm sure they talked about the International Plain Language Federation, which is a relatively new group made up of the various plain language organizations in countries around the world, who now have a website. So that's a link that you might be interested in, working on getting an international standards organization standard for plain language. And that group has also adopted our definition of plain: find, understand, and use, a behavioral definition, not based on reading grade levels or readability formulas, but on behavior, on who your audience is and communicating with that audience. And so if I wrap up this section about definitions by talking about content strategy to nouns. Nouns are never as good as verbs. So let's turn it into a verb, a phrase, a verb, thinking strategically about your content. And also aligning your content with the organization's goals while meeting users' needs. And so I think those are the two main elements of it, because look, we talked about the fact that in order to figure out how to audit your content, once you have an inventory, what to do about it, you need to understand what that content is trying to achieve. But in order to have a strategy, you have to understand what the organization is trying to achieve. So the organization's vision, mission, and goals drive all the strategies. Before you have a strategy, you must know what you're trying to achieve. But, and here's my big but, you succeed only when the people who need your content succeed. So it's both what is your organization trying to achieve, and how do you mesh that with what the people who need your content need. Because as Catherine mentioned, my book, Letting Go of the Words, the whole concept in that book is that everything we write is part of a conversation. And your website, your letters, your notices, your fact sheets, whatever it is you're creating, are conversing with the people on the other end of that conversation. And if they can't get in that conversation, if they don't understand that conversation, you're not being succeeded. You're not succeeding, no matter what your goals are. So I wrote the people. And it's, you know, one of the discussions we've had in the plain language world for a very long time is, what do we call those people? People sometimes object to the word users. When I write about the web, I do like to say site visitors, but they could be, in your world, letter recipients. Customers, are you in the government? Yes, you still do have customers, even though you're not in an e-commerce world. Well, sometimes you are in an e-commerce world. But I would rather that in your particular situation, you find the name that is relevant for you. So agency staff, first-time home buyers, taxpayers, you know, whatever they really, really are. And so actually, I want to give you as my first example of how this would work itself out in a content strategy from the IRS. And although many of the examples I'm going to be showing you in this talk are ones that I've been involved in, I have not at all been involved in this particular story. But on the IRS website, they actually give their mission, which I think is wonderful. And the first half of that mission is provide America's taxpayers top quality service by helping them understand and meet their tax responsibilities. So if you think about that as a mission, and then you look at the IRS's current website, it's very interesting, because compared to previous versions of this website, which were very, very busy and tried to serve everybody equally, This one serves the taxpayer. Get your refund status, view your account, where's your amended return, get answers to tax questions, and other audiences. Tax pros are up there. Charities and nonprofits, a particular type of business that has special rules, are up there. And the heart of the website is entirely, at least on the home page, focused on the people in the mission statement. Now, I don't know if IRS has a formal content strategy, but this would be a good indication of a content strategy. And by the way, I will say now, and you'll see some of the examples, that just as with many new sets of buzzwords, a lot of people have been doing this before it had a name, even if they never wrote up a formal content strategy, they were thinking strategically about it. So the one thing that I think, I'll just make a comment, if I had been involved in this, and I don't know if the people involved in this pushed the way I would have pushed for the first person rather than the second person in all of these. View my account, where's my amended return? There's interesting research in by a group called Which Test One, which reports on research that other people have done that they send in, and then they look at it and say, yes, this is worth doing, of a study which showed that many more click-throughs when the pronoun was my rather than your. Okay, how am I doing on time? Good. Okay, so now that I've given you some background and some context and a first example, let's talk about what actually goes into a content strategy. And I think actually there are as many versions of the slides I'm about to show you as there are people in content strategy. So this is by no means the only view of what goes into a content strategy. I think every writer, and there are now tons of books on content strategy, has their own list of what goes into a content strategy. And actually at the end of my slides, set of slides on this topic, I'm going to give you a link to the page at usability.gov, which has even a different set of things. But I think that this will give you a good picture of at least one view of a content strategy. And let's do it as discover, plan, align, and govern. So in discover, you have to understand what's the purpose of your organization. And by organization and by content strategy, that can be your group, your division, your agency, your department, the whole government. You know, it depends on what scope is feasible and is in your responsibility, or that you can, and I'm going to again push collaboration, that you can get to collaborate. And again, I'm going to give you some examples. But you have to really understand what's the vision, what's the mission, what's the goal. And then, of course, whom are you trying to reach with the content, which I would say is personas. And what problem are you trying to solve? Because doing a content strategy and thereby changing a lot of your content is not a short or easy thing to do. It requires resource, requires budget. If you don't have a problem, maybe you already have a good content strategy. So what problem are you trying to solve? And what are your main messages? And then by this, I mean mostly what's in scope, what's not in scope of what you're trying to do. And again, I'm going to give you an example of that in just a few minutes. So once you have discovery, you've discovered those things, now you need to, in fact, develop the content strategy. And I think the plan has a lot of words that start with P. So processes, how will you solve the problem? Basically, how will you get your content effectively and efficiently through the life cycle of that content? And in particular, an important part of processes at the strategy level is, particularly in a government agency, is what's the review process? Who will review it, when, and how? So I put that under processes, although of course the people who are the reviewers belong also under people. But for people, to carry out this content strategy, how many writers you will need, how much training do they need, editors, designers, producers, who else is involved, what human resources do you need? An important one for a strategy is policies. So an important part of a content strategy is your style guide, voice and tone guide, possibly design guide. So even if we're talking web, what are the content types is important, and what are the most important messages? And then of course there's pay. I mean, you need money, resources, and priorities, because part of a content strategy almost always, again, starts with the tactics to implement the content strategy, would include the inventory, that is what content do you have, and the audit, what are you going to do with each piece of that content, and what are the missing pieces of that content? So you get a whole set of work out of that, because it's unlikely that your audit is going to say, we're fine, we're just going to keep everything we have and it doesn't need any revision. It doesn't need any more plain language work than it's already had. Can you imagine? Well, when that day comes, we'll all be very happy, but it isn't where the world is. So what are you going to tackle first? What's your schedule for how you're going to actually get this done? And then the question of aligning and governing is very much part of strategy, that if you're only thinking on the tactical level, you're not getting to. And so making sure your plan fits with what you learned in the discovery part, that is with the agency's mission and goals, and also relevant other strategies in the organization. Because going back to my very first point, you're really after a great customer experience. You're not after just writing, right? And so how does what you are going to produce align with, meet the needs of both your users and your organization? And the last one, a part of strategy is how do you maintain it? So it's about governance. Who's in charge? Who decides when issues arise? How will you keep the content current? And here's a really important point that I push in every workshop. Every topic or page or document must have an owner and a schedule for when it is looked at again, because unless you do, you get websites. I work with a federal agency that I will not name, in which when we were migrating a whole lot of content in a content strategy, we discovered a page that said, in 2002, we will do the following. Right? Things like that get left if no one looks at it. And you not only have to have governance now, you have to have a process for how you change that when it happens. So a page has an owner, the owner, you know, you're all feds. You change jobs, you get promoted, somebody else comes in. The name on that page could be somebody who left 5 years ago. That's the governance. There is, if you say, oh, but that's the hardest part to deal with, there is a wonderful book by Lisa Welchman called Managing Chaos. it's particularly about digital governance. So if your content strategy is a whole database of letters, but I think that you could read it and just substitute your domain for the digital that Lisa is focusing on. Hey, so I hope that that helps you feel that you're comfortable with what goes in, but into a content strategy. But for another take on it, the usability.gov page, which quotes a lot from Christina Halverson, again, who first brought the notion of content strategy to the marketing and web world, and her stuff is just wonderful too. Okay, thinking about that, let's go and look at some examples. So one of the things is the scope of the content strategy that you want to create depends, at least in part, on the problem you're trying to solve. And so here is an example from a group that I spent about a year working with. Wonderful, wonderful people, Minnesota Department of Revenue. And the first problem that they wanted to address was too many phone calls about letters to taxpayers. I think almost anybody can empathize with this situation. And the discovery was, among other things, I mean, we could go to their mission, and I mean, just like the IRS, the mission is collect all the taxes to which that people owe, and to help taxpayers do that well so that we don't have to go after them. But one of the discoveries was the letters to taxpayers were not in plain language. And so they started with the letters to taxpayers, and they have also worked on the web. Customer service scripts, which another world that needs a good content strategy. And yes, they were very successful. They did achieve fewer phone calls, which was the immediate measure that they were going to follow. They also won a Clearmark Award from the Center for Plain Language. I trust that you all know that the Center for Plain Language, which is the United States nonprofit, non-Fed group, runs among its two major projects in the course of a year. One is a report card for federal agencies, which, by the way, is going to come out in a few weeks. The judging is finished. The report is being prepared. And the other in the spring, or people put in their examples in January, and in the spring, the judging for Clearmark Awards. This project also resonated so well that the Governor Dayton of Minnesota issued an executive order that all the agencies would have to do everything in plain language, comparable to our Plain Writing Act. Well, here, people, I do want to acknowledge, there could be many, many more names there, but Terry Steenblock, the Assistant Commissioner in charge of this project, and Melissa Dellinger, the project manager. And I will show you two. This is one version of the letter. This is another version of the letter, and I can, yeah, that's what won a Clearmark Award, because they had a content strategy. This is only one of many, many letters that were rewritten based on the new style that came out, was part of the content strategy. Another point to make is that setting the scope and policies can make some of your content audit easy, because, for example, and many of you know this example, that the new website in the UK, gov.uk, the purpose of which was to bring together many, many agencies into the same website, the problem, too many government websites with too many pages, and that people had to go to several websites to complete one task. And the discovery was that a lot of those websites had content that not relevant to the government, that they were just covering lots of interesting topics. And so they set the following policies. Government, this was their mantra: government should only do what only government can do. And we publish content only if users need it. And thereby, they were able to not bring over into gov.uk some more than 100,000 pages. And they couldn't have done that without the content strategy that said, here's our mission, here's our goals, here's our discovery, here's our problem. We're going to set a policy, and we're going to follow that policy. And it's on the basis of that that they then audited all the content. I will tell you another story that I don't actually have the example of here. I, for many years, worked with the state government in Washington State. And at one of the workshops for a particular state agency, we were talking about this sort of thing. And one of the gals from a particular state agency said, well, what I did was say that if nobody had visited a page in the last year, and you, the page owner, and if there was no page owner, that was it. But if there was a page owner, if you couldn't convince me that the topic needed to be, that it wasn't absolutely necessary information that nobody could find because our website was so complex, but we're taking it down. And she had a lot of pushback. People said, you can't do that. It's my page, and it's all about my office, and it's the bios of, you know. And she said, okay, if you get a phone call or an email or anything that tells you that somebody was actually looking for the information on that page, we will put it back. Of the thousands and thousands of pages that she took down, 2 went up in the next year. So, but you have to have the content strategy to say, this is our reason, this is why we're doing this. Okay. The other thing that I think is about content strategy, and this is, I'm going to get to the collaborating part that we were focused on, was that developing a content strategy often requires breaking down silos. So, and it's not only government that is very siloed, it's all kinds of organizations. When I was doing this talk for the content strategy meetup, we went through a case study of a project I had been involved with. I don't want to say too much about it, but it was for an organization that had members, and it got ways in which those members could benefit from discounts, deals that the organization arranged for it. And that was a revenue stream that if someone took advantage of something that the organization made possible for them, the organization got some win-win-win situation, right? But they weren't getting the use of that they wanted, that they expected. And I helped to look at what was happening. And what we discovered was that the web, the people making the arranging the stuff were here. The people who were putting out the web were here. The writing in the web was being done by an outside contractor who reported to yet another division. And so looking at the website, what we found was the website every month had very interesting articles that people might be interested in, but they had no relationship to the products that the website was trying to get people to take advantage of. And even when they didn't have a link to the product. So you had feature articles being developed in one silo and money-making deals being developed in another, and no communication. So what needed to happen, and what did happen, was a content strategy that said every article has to be about something we are hoping people will take advantage of and be linked to that, right? We're not in the business of just giving people nice recipes or telling them about something interesting. It's about breaking down the silos, or at least communicating across silos, right? That's what strategy is all about. So collaborating on a content strategy, I think, is about breaking down silos, forming a cross-functional team. And that's really the point at the strategy level is it does require, in almost every case, collaboration. Convincing people the problem is real, and I'm going to give you 2 examples for this. So how do you convince people that the problem is real? Because if you don't have everybody on board with that, you're not going to get to go ahead and do the strategy. So getting relevant data, if you're on the web, you certainly have access to web analytics, social media analytics, but for other types, error rates on forms, for example. I mean, I love to work on forms. So many of them are so bad, and it's easy to find the problems and often quite easy to fix them. But your relevant data might also be phone calls, whatever. But another really important way is to do a usability test of the current content, whether that's the website, letters, forms, fact sheets. And in the end of my talk, I'm going to talk about a tactic you can use when you can't do usability testing, but you really want to get as close to a usability test as you can. And then, of course, for this cross-functional team together to go through discovery, planning, aligning, and possibly with facilitation and training if the group can't function this way very well on its own. And then, of course, to establish governance to make the strategy work long-term. Okay. But in addition to the getting people together to collaborate on a content strategy, in order to produce a really successful customer experience, that content has to mesh with other strategies. So again, if we start with the organization's goals focused on users' needs, which I think should be the mantra, you have content strategy, and you might have a separate social media strategy. I worked with a government agency last year, the year before, where they actually were doing very well in terms of collaborating, but there were the content strategy, the content people and the social media people, right? And they each had their own ideas about what should happen, and just getting them together, that's really critical. SEO strategy, again, could be part, it should be part of your content strategy if your world is the web, but it could be other people. Usability strategy, right? And again, these should all be collaborating together, especially customer service strategy, because so I go back to a project that I did decades ago, pre-web, in which we were charged with helping to revise letters to make them clearer. And we did. And this was for a credit card company, which was going after people who owed delinquent debt. That is, they hadn't paid their credit cards on time. And one of the big things, the goal, was to get them to start paying a little bit by calling up and entering into a plan, right? And so we were working with the group that was responsible for that, and that was fine, except that when they called up and that got established, the next week they were still liable to get another dunning letter, because the system that led into customer service and the system that was sending out the letters were not connected. So the system sending out the letters didn't know that somebody had talked to customer service, right? And again, that's where we have to, if you're going to have a successful, you can just imagine the persona saying, but I just arranged for that. What are they doing to me, right? And I'm not going to bother paying these people anymore. I'm just going to forget about them, right? Anger. So it's this collaborating across even strategies. Now, again, in the government, you may not think about marketing strategy, but in fact, in many cases, you actually do have marketing and sales. And I've left one more, because somebody in the room, or maybe somebody who's participating in this remotely, wants to put into chat another strategy, another group that needs a strategy that needs to mesh with this that I haven't even put on here. Yeah.
So we have the infrastructure, the software and hardware infrastructure that's sometimes separate from all of this other stuff. In the government, we have CIO offices, and they handle like enterprise level, whatever it is. So
okay. So
we want to unify the content. We might have to unify platforms. We might have to do a standardized software, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so thank you for, so we'll put in there software and hardware infrastructure strategy. Yes, in fact, again, getting that content management system and the strategy for content management and how that affects it. So thank you, terrific. And I only put one empty one up there, but there may be more and more. But the point is that, and I don't know if you can see the little arrows, I mean, these all have to coordinate. And again, that requires breaking down even more silos. Right? So, yes, coordinate with other strategies, be sure you share the same vision and mission, have compatible goals, understand the same personas. Now, again, different personas may be relevant to different people, but at least we should all understand everybody's personas and work with other strategies. One of the big things, particularly if your world is the web, how do people know about the content? How do they even get to your website? So again, this is definitely coordinating social media and strategy, but it may even mean coordinating fact sheets that go out in the paper mail or that get distributed at meetings and conferences with the web. And again, governance, how are you going to keep that up so that you don't have an outdated link on a paper document that's not going to in fact lead to the current content? And then again, find out how usable the current content is and plan to find out how usable new content is. So again, a usability strategy. So if I go back to the notion of strategy and particularly the discover, purpose, persona, problem, and messages in scope or not in scope, but particularly the issue of the problem. This is a story actually from Annetta Cheek, who is kind of the founder of Plain when she was in the government, and the founder of the Center for Plain Language when she left the government. Before she left the government, she was at FAA. And she brought me in to FAA, this goes back some time, because they knew that the website wasn't working very well. And we wanted to bring together a web team, but not everybody understood that this was a problem and necessary. And so we did a usability test with people in many different audiences that FAA needs to reach. And it was a wonderful usability test, but people didn't do very well. Again, there are some of the statistics for it. And one of the quotes from a person whom they considered a very important part of their audience: the FAA is the set up the way they like it, not the way the public wants it. And one of the reasons was, well, you can see how busy it was, but also there were, if a form, and I'm making up this number, form 904 was developed out in the Northwest region. It was sitting on a Northwest region server. And you might look for it at the main FAA website, but you wouldn't find it because it wasn't there. So one of the content strategies was to bring everything together into a server. But the main problem was that people had so much trouble finding things. And so, yes, this convinced people. And after the content strategy, a major part of the organization was by person, with a landing page for each type of person. Now, FAA has done lots of things since then, but the point was, my point is, if you need to convince people of a problem, usability testing is one good way to do it. But you can't always do usability testing. So here is another way in which sometimes this can be done, and that is to bring everybody together in a training. So this is the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services, the state equivalent of federal HHS. And this was before the website, before content strategy. And you'll notice that the homepage, main area taken up by news, and then by different offices' website. So the typical office organization, you had to know which office covers your problem in order to get any information about it. And part of the problem was it was so deeply siloed into different administrations. And so what we did was a week-long training in which every group had to send a representative to the training. And I will tell you that on day one, the skepticism was up to the ceiling. By the end of the week, people had networked, had talked to each other, which met each other, found that they all had the same mission, because they really do all want to help the people who need their help, whether it's adoption or what I would call food stamps, which aren't food stamps anymore, or whatever the problem is. And this is, in fact, what it was. This is the current website. And they, in a sense, developed the vision and mission afterwards by realizing that they needed to do that. And so here is their vision and mission today. Vision: people are healthy, people are safe, people are supported, taxpayer resources are guarded. and mission as a department, we are tied together by a single mission to transform lives. They would not have said that way back when. So again, sometimes you need some impetus to pull this together. Oh, and this is, I was remembering, so this one that I'm showing you on, I don't know what number slide that is, was right after this happened, and this is the current version of the website, many years later still being kept. And another, the FAA example and this Washington's DSHS example predate the term content strategy. But that's in fact what we were doing, right? And so thinking about it, you go from problem, content strategy, to what's the solution to the problem. And so an example, for example, a very current example, the Bureau of the Fiscal Service in Treasury. The problem is that most of the information on the website is for government workers. It's all about the various, talking about infrastructure, software programs that people use from agencies. I'm sure GSA has people who are users of these programs, reporting your budget, reporting your expenses, report all of the reporting, debt collection if somebody owes your agency money, etc. But there also is information for non-government people, and it could be people who owe money, have their wages what's called garnished, have money being taken to pay, for example, child support, or they didn't get this. This is the division that pays everybody's benefits. So VA veterans who get a check, it actually comes out of this division. But for those people to find information when the website is just full of jargon that is actually plain language for the government people who use some of these software programs day in and day out, very difficult. And so, and they do have personas. So this is Robert, the former serviceman, currently getting VA benefits. And you can imagine, Robert didn't get his check this month, right? Persona, adjectives, everybody. Panicking, right? And going to this website and trying to find his information in the middle of all this information. And so the content strategy plan creates separate pathways, and the current website, this is the home page, basically setting you down on a pathway for the general public, as opposed to government agencies and businesses. And one last example, and then I think I'm getting to the tactic, and we'll have, Alex, there hasn't been much chat yet. No.
We'll get to it.
We'll get to it, okay. So another story, this is the Office of the Controller of the Currency. And here are my persona. Sally and Mike have been trying with no success to get their bank to resolve a dispute. And can the government help them? And in the, so the problem, information for bank customers, very hard to find. Most of the information on the site, quite correctly, is for the banking industry. And again, you know that this persona, anybody coming to complain about their bank, is angry, frustrated. You just, personas are so important to get into the heads of the people who are coming. And so these, they actually worth talking content strategy. The words had come into the vocabulary. And their solution was to create a separate site called helpwithmybank.gov, which here is, and this is Dana Holman and her wonderful team at Office of the Controller of the Currency. A very nice plain language site aimed particularly at Sally and Mike are my persona for them, not theirs, but the persona that I'm representing with Sally and Mike. So again, you have to have a strategy to know how you're going to carry out what you can do about your content. And of course, I hope that you'll include usability testing in any content strategy you develop, but you can't usability test everything. And you can inventory your database of letters or fact sheets or your web, and you're going to have hundreds of pages. You can't usability test every one of them. So what can you do? Now, the whole idea of auditing that inventory, so you get an inventory, you know all the content you have now. The whole idea of auditing is that you go through every page of your web page and you decide what to do with it. Sometimes, again, that decision is easy. It is so old and out of date and nobody would ever want it. It's about a project we finished 10 years ago. We're going to take it off. Legal says we have to have it available, archive it, right? Sorry?
Bury it.
Bury it.
It's accessible, but
Right, but it doesn't come, it's not going to come up in search. I remember a project I did with a government agency where the financial information changed from year to year, and the analysts needed the current financial information, but when they searched by the kind of financial information they were looking for, it came up in search chronologically from oldest to newest.
oh,
And so they would click on the first thing without thinking about it and be working with incorrect data. And again, the solution was very easy. You archive everything except the current one. And maybe you write a page that says if someone wants the history of it, you show a table of the history of it, but you don't have a live page for every past year that's going to come up in search ahead of the current one, right? That's content strategy. But if nobody thinks about it and you don't have a strategy, it's going to sit there and search is going to find it. And that's what's going to happen. So again, problem, solution, based on having content strategy. So to get back to the auditing, you could have a situation in which you have a page and you read it, it's in plain language, it's been done recently, it's beautiful, we keep it. You may have a page that it is everything you want, but the data isn't quite up to date. We're going to update it. So there are some fairly easy ones, but there's a lot that you maybe aren't quite sure about. That is the right content, that the audience will be able to find, understand, and use it. So I want to propose this 4-step tactic for auditing content. And again, this works very well for letters, fact sheets, and I just did a workshop with a non-government group that supports a government agency. And we used a fact sheet as our example, and this process really showed that it needs a lot of change. And that is, here's my process. Why, who, walk your persona through the conversation, and then use that information to decide what to do. So why? Know why people need this content. What's the purpose for the organization of this specific content? What do you want people to do after reading or using it? Because you realize that everything that you put out from the government is functional. It's meant to have people do or not do something. So I want to propose that you always use this sentence. My communication will be successful if these people do this. And you fill that out, right? My communication will be successful if people who want to complain about their bank know if it's a national bank that the OCC can help with or not, where to go if it's not one we can help with, and get to complain. So only keep content that serves important purposes for the organization and the user. And then step 2, personas, know who will use this content. And here is the concept of what we call an assumptive persona. Of course, the best personas are built on lots of data. But even if you don't, in almost every case, I find that we can imagine that persona. You resonated with Sally and Mike and their complaint, right? So an assumptive persona is a person with a picture and a name, because pictures and names make us have people we're having conversations with, and a relevant story, a scenario that's relevant for this. So I propose this, and it's interesting, Catherine, because so far the slides from my Mac to the PC have been perfect, but the lines here, the writing on lines, but you folks who are picking up on these slides, you make your own situation here, so the lines don't really matter. So I say picture and name, and excuse me, and then the sentence that tells us about the name person. Thank you. Catherine just handed me my tea to. So for those who are listening, I apologize, and I'm going to cough again, and I think I'll be okay. So picture, you name your persona with a respectful name. And then the first sentence is something about that person, the job or personal title, anything that tells us why this person is relevant for the content we're going to be looking at. Then why, from their point of view, they're coming. So, and now because, and the third sentence is the adjectives or phrases that make us feel the empathy for that person. Busy, tired, frustrated, angry. It could be curious, but to be honest, it's much more often not. And then you use this persona and story and the technique on the next slide. And then this is the heart of it. You walk the persona through the conversation. So you become the persona. You put your usability in plain language hat sort of over one ear, and you become the persona. And you talk through the experience and reactions as the persona, answering questions like this: what's your day like today? You know, so there's where the persona is saying, I just got home from work and I'm really tired, but I really have to deal with this problem that I have, right? How did you get to this content? So I had to ask the question with the fact sheet, for example. How did somebody actually get that? Do you read it right away? If not, what do you do with it? Do you read all of it? What part of it do you go to first? How do you react to it? Basically, you're talking through your story, but based on these questions. Does it answer your questions, or any sentences or words unclear to you? What are you going to do now? And when we did this with the fact sheet and knowing who it was going to go to, some said, well, it came in the, it's possible that it came in the mail and I didn't know what it was and I didn't know why I needed to look at it, so I put it aside. Most of the stories that the persona told were, it didn't speak to me. I didn't read it, right? And then, of course, step 4, use the why, who, and walk to analyze the content. Is the current version successful? So this sentence, if you use it, and I think you need to use it with an actionable, do this. So I don't accept when I work with groups, my communication will be successful if the people who get this correspondence understand what we're saying. You can't see understanding. Why do you want them to understand it? What do you want them to do because they understand it? Sometimes it's making a decision. Sometimes it's actually acting in some way other than making a decision.
So
That's,
say things like learn or understand would not.
and you can't, why do you want them to learn? What do you want them to do because they've learned that? And so that's why I think an important part of the walking the user through the conversation is, what would you do now? There are times, I will admit, when of course, you don't know if they're actually going to do it. Just as with usability testing, our definition is find, understand, and use. But in a usability test, you can only actually see, find, and hear if they understand, because you can ask them to tell you what message they got out of it. But you can only ask them, what would you do now? And hope they would say something that allow you to understand that they would do a good use action. And so if it doesn't work well, now you bring your usability, your plain language hat back on the top of your head. What would make it work better? Does it need different content, a better title, better organization, more headings, different headings, better writing, different layout? You know, what is it? This is your plain language expertise to solve the problem that you saw. Okay, that's what I had, and it is just timed to leave us 15 minutes for questions and comments. So I'll take questions and comments both from folks here and Alex from the chat, if we have any.
Sure, we can start from in the room. If anybody has questions, feel free to come up and speak into the microphone. If not, we'll move on.
Okay, do we have any questions in the chat?
So we have two here that are a little bit similar, and this comes from a little bit earlier in your presentation, Ginny. Emily Springer and Laura Peterson. Emily asks, what was the source that reported that my/first person versus your being more effective? And Laura sort of tags on to that. I'm also interested in pronouns. We were using my 10 years ago and we're told it was old school. We're using your now and have been for the past decade. Hard to keep up with the cool kids.
Well, I may not be keeping up with the cool kids either, because this was a study reported on Which Test Won at least 5 years ago, because I used it in a 2013 content strategy talk. I don't off the top of my head, I apologize, I can't give you the reference for that off the top of my head. Is there some way, Alex, of
We can follow up afterwards.
Follow up afterwards with that? Old school, new school doesn't really make me feel that we should be following that. It's not trends that matter. It's what is most successful to get your audiences, to meet your audience's needs and your organizational goals. So I just don't know why we would just change because we've used one for a while and now we should use another. I will try to find the source, go back in my records and try to find the source and give it to Alex.
Perfect. And we'll remind everyone of that. So a little bit more on finding things people are looking for good sources. Tracy asks, and this comes, Ginny, when you were talking about that content must mesh with other strategies. Do you have a preferred strategy template that includes the different content strategies mentioned? Do you remember that? I think this is when you were talking about the silos, perhaps.
It was the circles. There was content
Strategy and all that.
right.
marketing.
I'm not sure exactly what the question is. If you're talking about what methodology for getting them together, it's really the same methodology as getting a content strategy together, just at a broader level. That is basically bringing people who are responsible for these different strategies into a room together and talking about getting consensus on the organization's vision, mission, and goals. And I don't think that has to be formal. I mean, I know organizations that have spent months working on the wording of a mission statement, and I don't think that that's necessarily a good use of the time. It's just in general, what are we doing here? Sometimes it is just valuable to bring people together in a room. I'll tell another story. I was working, I was consulting with a group that helps banks, mortgage companies with their paperwork. So we're talking about a world in which there's an application that people fill out, and it goes into the organization and someone reviews it and vets it, and it leads to a set of letters, and it lives in a computer and like that. And people were having a problem with the documents, but we were getting some pushback as to whether or not anything needed to be done. And so I facilitated what I would call a process workshop. That is, everybody who represented a part of the organization that in some way dealt with the paperwork for this problem. Let's just say a mortgage. So from the broker who meets the potential buyer, the application, et cetera, all the way around. And what we did over the course of a couple of days was go through the life cycle of the story. And it was fascinating, writing down, doing a graphic picture of the storyboard of what happened and who the people involved were, what's now called a customer journey, right? And it was fascinating because partway through, persons sitting on this side of the table, because we sat people in the order of the life cycle, said, actually somebody early on looked at somebody later on and said, oh, that's why that has to be on there. I had no idea why anybody ever used that piece of information. And now I understand how important it is to your part of the process. So that idea of getting people together to understand how their piece fits into the whole is really what it's all about.
Thanks, Ginny. We had another question about, let's see, a sample content strategy. I'll follow up with Catherine and you on that afterwards. But here's one for you. Speaking of pronouns, what does the plain language community think about using the gender neutral they for a singular person? While naturally I support gender neutral communications when needed, I find using a plural pronoun for a single person confuses our readers. Am I doing it wrong?
That's interesting. I'd like the data on confusing your readers because as a linguist, one of the things that linguists know is that language changes. Language changes over time due to many different factors. If you think about English and you go back to 1600, as you know, because anybody who reads the Bible in English knows that we once had thee and thou. We once had the plural ye. Today, we do not make a distinction, at least in American English, between the singular and the plural in the second person. You and you, unless you live in the South and you have y'all and you all y'all and other dialectal versions. But basically, you and you. We are currently in a period of change when the third person plural is becoming the singular. I find that when I was doing workshops, those of you who are listening remotely may not see my gray hair, my white hair, but when I was doing workshops, say a decade or two ago, and I would say, how many people are comfortable with the sentence, everyone must turn in their timesheet on Friday, would have be pulling their hair out. And I would get some people who would say, today, I don't think even the questioner would have a problem with everyone must turn in their timesheet on Friday. So for the possessive pronoun, we're very comfortable with the plural becoming the singular. People are still about using the plural for a individual as the primary pronoun. That's changing. We're just in a period of change. Miriam, Catherine, Kate, does Plain have a stand on that?
I don't really have an official stand simply because right now there's a split. So there is not enough of a definitive source on either side.
Right, Miriam,
say
yeah.
yes or no.
Miriam says there,
Yeah.
Plain doesn't have an official stance because of what I just said. We're in a period of transition. I will tell you, when my grandchildren are my age, it is very likely that he and she will be gone.
And also, we, as a rule, do not rule on grammar or style guide issues, so we may be able to skate over this one too.
Okay.
You may see us using that in our communication because that is our personal preference. That's our personal decision that we've made, but that's not Plain deciding that that's the right way. That's Plain deciding that it's one of the acceptable ways.
Right. There's a comment in the back of the room, and I'll take it and I'll repeat it for the microphone.
Okay, John McWhorter's Lexington Valley podcast that I assume there's somebody in the room has heard of. He did an entire podcast on pronouns in English, and the history of pronouns in English is fantastic. I highly recommend.
So, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Bethany from LPM.
Bethany reminds us that John McWhorter, who does a podcast about the English language, did an entire one on the history of pronouns, and she highly recommends it. And thank you, because I know John McWhorter, I mean, I know of him and of his work, but I had not heard that particular podcast, and so I will go and find it too.
Sure, it was the